In 1924, the damage from another huge storm showed that Skara Brae needed a lot more professional care. Skara Brae was placed under the guardianship of the Commissioners of Works by the trustees of William George Thomas Watt, the 9th Laird of Breckness. He had died childless in 1909, leaving no direct line of succession. The village area of half a hectare was scheduled as an ancient monument on the 27th of March 1928. An inner buffer zone of about 10 hectares around it was scheduled on the 31st of October 1977. During 1925 through 1926, a 4-metre-high seawall was constructed to protect the deteriorating buildings. This measure was a pioneering tactic for heritage conservation. The fact that almost 100 years later the seawall is still standing and protecting the site from the fierce North Atlantic storms is a testament to the quality of its design and construction, although it has been refortified several times since 1927. In 1927, the Office of Works hired a contractor to clear House 1 down to the level exposed by Black Willie, along with houses 2, 4 and 5. Although the contractor was instructed that the real purpose of the job was to prepare the buildings for display to tourists, it was recognised that the site would benefit from proper monitoring by a professional archaeologist. That same year, the Australian Professor Gordon Childe had been appointed Professor of Archaeology at the University of Edinburgh. He was the first to admit he was better at writing than digging, which he loathed. The excavation of the village took place from 1927 through 1930 under the control of contractor John Firth of Kirkwall. Contrary to most reports, Childe was not directly involved in the physical work, but in his words, afforded facilities for observing and recording the archaeological remains that might incidentally come to light. The demands of display and the restrictions on his appointment meant that Childe could not direct the excavation as he might have wished in order to answer the many questions posed by the site. This left plentiful work for future research. Nevertheless, through Skara Brae and his later work, Childe became deservedly one of the 20th century's most famous archaeologists. Yet he never earned a degree in the subject, his only qualification at the time being that of a Bachelor of Arts. He had entered the diploma course at Oxford in classical archaeology, which he never completed, graduating as a B. Lit instead in 1916. Visitors to the site included John Wilson Patterson, a Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, who was architect for Scotland in the Ministry of Works and co-authored the first report on the work at Skara Brae with Childe. John Houston of the Ministry of Works was in charge of surveying in order to map the structures to a high degree of precision. I guess he would be impressed with today's technology. I have relied upon Houston's published floor plans as the definitive maps of the site, apart from the mislocation of the House 2 watch chamber. Two of Childe's notebooks for 1928 to 1930 have been digitised and are available online through University College London. I will refer to them from time to time to provide more contemporaneous detail of the site work. Childe's book, Skara, Brae, a Pictish village in Orkney, published in 1931, is a benchmark on how to communicate archaeological findings to a wide audience. In 1933, he produced the first edition of a guide to Skara Brae, again written in plain language. Prior to this, he had, like George Petrie and others, presented his findings in 1929 jointly with Patterson to a meeting of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, who subsequently published them in volume 53 of their proceedings. Despite this, Childe was ostracised by the Edinburgh establishment, as it was thought that the prestigious position he held for some 20 years should have gone to a real Scotsman. Although he had very few students at Edinburgh and was definitely no Indiana Jones-style archaeologist, Childe did inspire a few female students, including Margaret Simpson, who assisted at the Skara Brae site, which he worked on until 1930. As a useful starting point, the contractor had the maps compiled by Sir Henry Dryden in the 1870s to guide his excavations. Work commenced in House 1 on the plan. No new features were found, apart from a short passage that led to a small circular chamber about 120 centimetres in diameter. In this chamber, a large collection of artefacts were found, mostly of bone, including 3,000 beads, bone pins, and fragments of pottery, and a magnificent necklace. Childe commented that the north wall of House 1 had apparently been rebuilt since Petrie's time, since he could find no trace of the chambers in that wall, which is not surprising, since he was looking for them in the wrong house. As you can see, the arrangement of the floor plan as reconstructed by John Firth differs greatly from that in the original discovery by Black Willie. You may ask, does that really matter? Well, it depends whether you subscribe to the school that demands scrupulous accuracy, which is where I lean. Surely it wouldn't take too much effort to unscramble the mix-up and restore the two houses to their original state as first revealed by William Watt and George Petrie. The debris on the wall tops was removed by the contract workmen, and the loose stones throughout secretly bedded in cement. I have no problem with that, as it gave the structures some stability to make them safer to work around. The excavation then switched to House 2, which was found to be as discovered by Petrie and Watt, including the two chambers on the north wall. However, because of the mix-up over the floor plans, the reconstruction of House 2 did not restore it to the layout as originally found by Black Willie. The dresser on the north wall of House 2, clearly shown in the sections drafted by Sir Henry Dryden from George Petrie's plans, is missing from the House 2 we see today. Also, The niches shown in Dryden's 1879 plans and sections, in which Black Willie found a number of important artefacts, have been filled in during the modern reconstruction. There are many differences in the floor plan layout, which I have highlighted here. Few artefacts were found in House 2, apart from one bodkin in the western chamber, which must have been missed by Black Willie, and a few bone needles and walrus tusks in the hearth. At this stage, Childe did not know the functions of the boxed areas that later were recognised as beds. Near the hearth, the workmen found 2 bone picks, a quantity of bone beads, some of them highly polished, and an effigy with incised markings. Moving to the east of House 1, John Firth excavated House 3, finding that the greater part of the house, as excavated by Petrie and Watt, had been washed away by storms. Several artefacts were found that must have been missed by Black Willie, all lying close to a complete floor box. These included bone beads and needles and 2 ironstone implements. Across the passage from House 3, Firth cleared out House 4, exposing the layout as shown in Petrie's plans, including the drain below floor level. Petrie had found House 5 through the entry that came from House 4, so Childe recommended excavating that area, and thus House 5 was rediscovered. The floor was paved with thin slabs covering a drain which connected through to that under House 4. House 5 measured almost square, 5.6 metres from east to west and 4.4 metres from north to south. The usual stone slab furniture layout was found. A carved stone ball was found in the opening between House 4 and House 5, described by Childe as having flat circular bosses comparable with the finest balls of this class, while a perforated wide bone needle was found in the eastern bed. By the close of the 1927 season, Firth and his team had cleaned out all 5 houses discovered over a period of 18 years by Black Willie and George Petrie. They had traced the main passageway out through the sand cover to the west, although it remained filled with sand, and begun to follow the continuation of the passage to the south. All in all, a massive achievement in the space of only 1 year. The following year, 1928, Childe focused on the midden, which he correctly believed would host a wealth of artefacts. The midden proved to be quite huge, extending far beyond the structures unearthed to that time. Just west of the entrance to House 2, a whale's head was found in the midden material covering the roof of the main passage. Further back towards House 1, an attempt was made to investigate a doorway, but it was blocked by collapsed roofing slabs. Instead, the area was dug out from above and disclosed portion of what became known as House 6. In the course of the clearing, a large portion of a short-horned bull, including its skull, was recovered. Although the outline of the walls of House 6 was traced, the walls were deemed too unstable to allow excavation safely to the floor, and work was suspended until the following season. a large number of artefacts were recovered from the midden material that filled House 6. Instead, attention was directed to the southern passage, which was found to be filled with clean sand and thus easy to remove. The passage was partially paved with slate flags and roofed over for its entire 6-metre length. It led to a kind of vestibule from which 4 separate entrances were found, plus the continuation of the passage. One was found later to be the southern doorway of House 6, while opposite was an entry gallery that led into what proved to be House 7, the most fascinating of all the houses at Skara Brae. Instead of midden material, this house was filled with clean drift sand, and the state of preservation was very good. Abundant red deer antlers, exceeding 25 in number, and piles of shells lay on the floor near a rectangular hearth filled with ashes. The floor consisted of red clay about 10 centimetres thick, overlying a similar thickness of sand, below which was shale bedrock, with interspersed blue clay soil. The masonry walls were founded on solid bedrock, and the layout of House 7 typical of Skara Brae, a rounded square 5.2 metres across. House 7 is the template for the replica house constructed at the Visitors Centre, the only dwelling at Skara Brae that is open for inspection. There was nothing that would provide information as to how the houses were roofed. John Houston worked out a hypothetical completion of the roof based on the beehive principle. This suggested a vault shape about 4.3 metres high at the apex. House 7 had no windows, but numerous niches in the well-built walls, as well as a deep recess in the southeast wall. Stone slabs set in the floor formed what Childe called pens, now considered to be beds, each paved with slate. Against the rear wall, facing the door, was a 2-tiered dresser, exactly like the one in House 1. The top shelf was bare, but the lower contained broken pottery and burnt bones. The hearth, as usual, was in the centre of the room. Immediately behind it stood an enormous block of stone, roughly cubic in shape. This was assumed to be the base for a timber post supporting the roof. In front of the dresser was a pit, later called a limpet box, 40 centimetres deep. Another 3 pits had been sunk into the floor near the western corner. They were lined with slate, and the slate joints sealed with clay to render them watertight. At the back of the western bed, a large upright slab was built into the wall, projecting out at right angles to another slab parallel to the wall, resting on a horizontal slab on the floor. When this horizontal floor slab was raised, it disclosed a human skull and bones firmly embedded in a glutinous mass of clay. The legs were doubled up, and the whole body was contracted, facing outwards. After this skeleton had been extracted, the pelvis and long bones of a second came into view, in a position remarkably similar to skeletons found in Egyptian graves of similar age. Skeleton 2 lay in a contracted position on its left side with the legs drawn up nearly to the chin. The left arm was extended beneath the body and legs, while the right arm was bent at the elbow to an angle of 45 degrees, so that the hand was in front of the face. The tomb had been clearly built into the wall by the original constructors of House 7. On the top edge of the stone slab that marked the outer wall of the adjacent pen or bed, Childe discovered an inscription that he believed to be associated with the interment. Childe considered the markings to be alphabetiform signs, but could offer no explanation as to their meaning. They are still a puzzle to archaeologists to this day. The skeletons were shipped to Thomas Hastie Bryce, the Regius Professor of Anatomy at Glasgow University. He confirmed that both were female and that both suffered from osteoarthritis, with the knee joints most profoundly affected, as well as spondylitis deformans, or severe spinal deformity. One woman was over 164 centimetres tall, and the other about 161 centimetres tall, similar to the present-day inhabitants of the Orkney Islands and Scotland generally. Both had stout legs and were well into middle age, according to Professor Bryce. Presumably this means around 45 to 65 years of age. After examination, the skeletons were sent to the British Museum. On the 10th of May 1941, German bombs caused serious damage and a fire which must have vaporised the skeletons, as they were totally destroyed. A unique feature of House 7 is the fact that the sole entrance door could only be bolted from the outside. Thus the speculation that it may have been a prison or some form of quarantine for people suffering a communicable disease. An abundance of bones, fragments of pottery, implements and ornaments were littered throughout House 7. Large cooking pots contained a mass of animal bones, the relics of a prehistoric stew. A basin hollowed out from whalebone lay beside a stone mortar. A small cup made from a whale vertebrae lay opposite another similar cup. 2 bone picks and a scapula that had been used as a shovel lay next to the dresser, together with several walrus tusk pendants. House 7 was the culmination of the work of the 1928 season. Continuation of the exploration of the site awaited the summer of 1929. Childe returned to site on the 16th of July 1929 at the start of the university summer vacation, again at the invitation of the Ministry of Works to observe and record the archaeological remains that might come to light during excavation. There remained 3 loose ends to be followed up from 1928. The first, the completion of the excavation of House 6. Secondly, the continuation of Passage C past House 7. And thirdly, the continuation of Passage A to the west. Starting with the excavation of House 6, Firth and his crew found that the entry from the main passageway was not, in fact, a door, but rather a collapsed section of the north wall of House 6. The real door to House 6 was the southern entry from the vestibule outside the entry to House 7. Excavation revealed a typical floor layout, with a hearth in the centre of an almost square space, the floor sloping upwards towards the north to be at least a metre higher than the floor of House 7. Amongst the artefacts unearthed was a stone paint pot, still containing red paint. Investigating under the floor level of the northern part of House 6, the collapsed lintels of a deep and narrow passage, D, running roughly west to east, were found below the floor of passage B and extending under the floor level of House 5. Beneath House 5, an earlier buried house termed 5A was discovered, filled with compacted midden mixed with broken slabs from the earlier roof and walls. This unexpected discovery revealed that Skara Brae had been through several stages of construction and habitation, the village we see today having been built on an earlier phase of habitation. Attention then turned to the exploration of Passage C beyond the vestibule outside House 7. The passage was found to follow the eastern wall of House 7. The roof was intact and the most perfect example of original roofing in Skara Brae. A small cell, C2, which Childe speculated may have been a guardhouse, was opened up and found to contain the skulls of 3 otters. Just south of the cell, the passage rose gently, the floor being paved with slates and roofed with solid flagstone slabs. Opposite a niche into the wall of House 7, a gated opening from the passage led to the midden outside. Beyond this doorway, the gallery rose slightly, and no trace of roofing was found, the space being entirely filled with clean drift sand. The passage was followed almost to the Office of Works fence, where traces of broken roofing slates again appeared. However, the walls were in bad condition, and pending an extension to the worksite boundary, nothing more could be done safely. Meanwhile, in an attempt to stabilise the overarching west wall of House 7 by cementing the upper flagstones, the drift sand was cleared from the outside to provide access. This excavation revealed a gallery following the west wall. The floor of this gallery was nearly 150 centimetres above the floor of House 7, but coincident with the base of a recess above the tomb. Childe speculated that the recess may have been the entry to a balcony on that side of House 7. House 7 thus appeared to be a much larger and more elaborate structure than had been originally supposed. It appears to be a self-contained complex, partly surrounded by a winding gallery, perhaps some form of lookout or defensive position. The third task set for 1929 then commenced, clearing Passage A westward from the point left in 1928. The passage was roofed throughout with slates, which were so cracked that their removal was inevitable. The north wall was in good condition, but the south wall bulged badly and needed remediation. A little over 4 metres from the entry to House 2, the passage was barred by a gate consisting of 2 large slabs built into each wall, constituting the jambs, a slab on edge forming the sill, and a metre above it, a flagstone forming the lintel. The bar holes for closing the gate were on the eastern side of the door. A huge lozenge-shaped slab found on the floor just inside the sill may have been the original door itself. Through the door, the passage continued westwards into an antechamber with another doorway to the west. Beyond this portal, the passage emerged onto an open area filled with drift sand, which, when removed, revealed a large space neatly paved with slates, fitted together in the manner of a crazy pavement. No fireplace or other fixtures were found, so Childe concluded that it was not a dwelling, but perhaps had served as the village marketplace, bounded by low external walls through which 4 streets emerged. The area to the south of the marketplace was in a state of complete ruin, the roof and walls having completely collapsed. 5 remarkable stone objects were discovered in or near the entry of this ruin. They included a shale club, rudely worked by chipping, a pointed implement of shale shaped by grinding with a rounded butt, a 2-pointed implement of shale, clearly not turned by a lathe, the cross-section being nowhere near cylindrical. The broader end has been worked down not to a sharp point, but rather to a very narrow blade, and is elliptical in cross-section. A 3-spiked object made of shale has a convex band encircling the body, marked off from the terminal spikes by 2 grooves. It's decorated with a carved pattern. A double axe of shale with an integrated handle all in one piece. The blades are chipped as if by use. This object is unique, not only amongst all the thousands of artefacts recovered at Skara, Brae, but in all the Neolithic axes in museums throughout the world. Regrettably, the axe apparently disappeared soon after discovery, and only a few photos taken by Childe remain as a record. A still more puzzling object was found near the entry of the passage that opens into the marketplace from the west. Childe exclaimed that it was one of the most astonishing monuments to human patience and skill ever discovered in Scotland. Though made of hard volcanic rock similar to andesite, it had been shaped by grinding with extraordinarily accurate proportions. It is decorated with 5 horizontal ridges, divided into 2 groups by vertical ridges. The ends are divided by deep V-shaped notches intersecting at right angles. Childe could not fathom its use, and neither has anyone else. The north wall of the marketplace proved to be the external wall of a building subsequently christened House 8, or the workshop. The doorway was spanned by a single solid flagstone lintel carrying 6 courses of masonry above it, and was sheltered by a veranda of slates. The door was entered from a paved porch roofed over with slate. As usual, the bar holes to the door were on the inside. The western and eastern sides contained wide alcoves and numerous niches. A double-shelved cupboard stood in the eastern alcove, the upper shelf being carved along its edge with a rough chevron pattern. Beyond a partition lay a complex structure which John Patterson pointed out bore a resemblance to a pottery kiln. The slab paving on either side of the kiln was covered in burnt slates, typical of those used to line medieval kilns, beside which were heaps of yellow clay that was probably the raw material for the village potters. The simple fire pit kiln is typical of other Neolithic pottery sites. Although provided with a central hearth of the usual pattern, House 8 lacked the beds and floor boxes found in the other dwelling places. This supported the concept that House 8 was a workshop. A pillar covered with carvings was projecting from the southeast corner of the hearth. The pillar was removed and is now on display in the Skara Brae Visitors Centre. No less than 390 chert and flint scrapers, as well as chisels and 10 smoothed knuckle bones of aurochs, were collected from the floor of House 8, further evidence that it was a workshop. The final task of the 1929 season was the clearance of Sandy Midden from Passage F, the entry to which was found while excavating the marketplace. Numerous artefacts were recovered along the passage, which came to a dead end at a huge slab built into the outer wall of House 7. Passage F had once been roofed with slates, but they had entirely fallen in. Among the artefacts recovered along the way was a decorated stone and some pottery fragments. Just prior to the conclusion of operations for the year, the site was visited by George Lansbury, the first Commissioner for Works in the British Labour government. Despite his 71 years of age, Lansbury scrambled fearlessly around the site and into the dark passages, one of which was named in his honour. Childe left site on the 23rd of August when the work programme finished for the year, returning early in May 1930 with some of his students for the final period of clearance work. One of them, Margaret Simpson, graduated to become the first professional female archaeologist in Scotland and became the Assistant Inspector of Ancient Monuments in the Ministry of Works. The first task for 1930 was to clear up the walls exposed south and west of the marketplace and Passage F. The continuation of the main passage west of House 8 porch was cleared of sand. Beyond a strip of paving, the west wall of House 8 continued north to the beachfront. The paving marked the western limit of the village. South of the marketplace, excavation revealed 3 separate walls radiating in divergent directions from the southeast corner of the marketplace. No domestic structures and very few artefacts were found, leading Childe to speculate that they were merely retaining walls built to prevent dune sand encroaching from the southwest. The only structure of interest was a small cell bounded by low walls, perhaps a sentry box. From there, the contractors moved across to Passage F to continue tracing it around the southwest wall of House 7 and see if it linked up with the extension of Passage C, which Childe had renamed the Lansbury Gallery. The outer wall of House 7 did continue round to the Lansbury Gallery, but Passage F terminated earlier, as did the gallery, so their ends were some 6 metres apart. In that 6-metre gap, the contractors discovered 2 shallow graves, level with the top courses of the wall of House 7, running under the boundary fence and only 45 centimetres below the surface of the turf. The first grave had been completely wrecked by the construction of the boundary fence, sinking the fence posts having smashed the covering slabs. Only the lower jaw, right shoulder blade, 3 ribs, a couple of vertebrae, and a few fingers could be rescued. About 60 centimetres to the east, midway between the fence posts, the edge of a grave covered with thin slabs at 45 centimetres below surface was observed. Because part of the grave lay outside the boundary fence, the Ministry of Works had to obtain permission to explore the area from Colonel Henry William Scarth, known as Billy, who had become the 11th Laird of Breckness and Scale in 1929. The request was approved. 3 capstones were removed, revealing upright slabs, 3 on each side and 1 at each end, lining a grave 170 centimetres long internally by 30 centimetres wide. Inside the grave lay a complete skeleton, measuring 163 centimetres from the toes to the tip of the skull. The toes were in the southeast corner, the skull at the north end facing west, the body lying slightly to the right, with the left arm at the side right against the east wall of the grave. Identified by Childe as a female, the skeleton was in an excellent state of preservation, the traces of flesh still adhering to the bones. The skeletons were sent to Arthur Robinson, Professor of Anatomy at the University of Edinburgh. He was also former President of the Anatomical Society of Great Britain and a Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. Robinson confirmed Childe's estimate that the almost complete skeleton was that of a female, 160 to 163 centimetres tall. The hands and feet were small and slender. All the teeth were present. He inferred that the woman was 30 to 35 years old, of medium height and graceful form. She did little or no muscular work and took little physical exercise. She was probably right-handed. She was likely loquacious, accustomed to giving orders and to seeing that they were obeyed. There was no indication as to the cause of death. The other skeletal parts were probably a male, not old, with few teeth, but much worn. His calculated stature was 173 centimetres. Like the other skeletal remains from Skara, Brae, both these skeletons also seemed to have vanished. The next task was to follow the exit from the Lansbury Gallery out to the sandy midden east of House 7. Excavation revealed the remnants of a house later named House 9, the access from the Lansbury Gallery being through a breach in the gallery wall. The original House 9 doorway was through Cell 1 from Passage C. House 9 followed the typical layout of a central hearth flanked by boxed beds, but in this house the beds were recessed into the wall rather than projecting out from the wall. In the usual position, centred on the rear wall opposite the original door, were the remnants of a dresser, recessed into the wall like the beds. A cell in the south corner was floored with slates. The few relics found in House 9 were of exceptional interest. A pick lay between the southern bed slab and the hearth, and on the other side of the hearth was a perforated antler shaft for a stone axe, and a grooved ball of camptonite, an igneous rock. Continuation of the removal of midden material east of House 9 revealed the dilapidated remains of House 10, which was in far worse plight than House 9. Segments of the southern and western walls, half a beehive cell, and a tiny section of the east wall alone survive. No doorway or hearth could be found, but 3 buttresses projecting from the northwest wall probably are the remains of a dresser. Despite its ruined condition, House 10 yielded relics of even greater interest than House 9, including 2 fine, though broken, pins and several tools. At floor level, but just outside the wall of House 10, the workmen found a remarkable polished scraper sharpened by grinding. On one side, a geometrical pattern has been scratched. A big pot, adorned with alternating bands of horizontal ribs and knobs, stood right against the western wall of House 10. Another fine pot, decorated with incised wavy lines and circular impressions, stood near the cell. The floor was littered with broken bones, shells, and one complete antler. Close to what had likely been the dresser on the north wall of House 10, John Firth found a curious slate figure that Childe suspected was a very summary representation of a human figure with arms and legs spread out. The east end of the site had been neglected since 1870 and was covered with weeds. In tidying up this area, the contractor exposed a rough wall, seemingly continuing the south wall of the main passageway. The northern wall of the passageway proved to be a low retaining wall that petered out just past the entrance to House 3. The outer wall of House 4 on the eastern side proved to have been so well built that Childe concluded it must have originally been designed for full exposure to the elements, and thus marked the outer limit of the village. Following the wall south to the join with House 10 revealed a well-made stone basin, like an outdoor bath or pool. This discovery prompted John Houston to investigate the drainage system, which Black Willie had first found under House 4. A trench was dug from the outer wall of House 4 and revealed a nascent house layout dubbed House 4 Dashed. The remains of a drain were exposed, a section across the trench being sketched by Childe in his notebook. Only a small corner of House 4 Dashed could be explored without imperiling the main House 4. The entry lay to the south, the door jambs being slabs projecting edgewise as usual. The north wall of the doorway is thick and contains a small beehive cell under which the drain from House 4 passes. A recess on the south side of the doorway may have been occupied by a dresser. A thin slab of sandstone with very coarse serrations, like the teeth of a saw, was found in the recess. House 4- seems to have opened on a passage to the south that appears to lead straight to the stone bath. East of House 3, another large drain was discovered in a test pit. It may have connected with House 5. The works team followed this drain to its termination at the edge of the beach. This connection caused Childe to rethink the purpose of the subterranean structure under House 5, which he had first thought might be an earlier house. Instead, he now postulated that it might be a sump or a cistern, with the drain to the beach taking the overflow. John Patterson designed a concrete hatch with rungs on its walls to make the cistern accessible to visitors and students. This worked admirably and was much appreciated by visitors. In Childe's opinion, the ideal final laying out of the site would be to reproduce as closely as possible its appearance at that period in its history at which the best preserved structures were in use. As early as 1929, the architect James Smith Richardson, who had been appointed the first inspector of ancient monuments for Scotland, suggested that, given the softness and easy weathering of the flagstone of which the village was built, the whole site should be roofed over, an idea which had been supported by Commissioner Lansbury. Even though Childe was reluctant to see the site disfigured by a roof, he did agree that a roof for House 7, as the most perfect prehistoric structure in Europe, was essential. Childe vacated the site at the end of June 1930 as a metal and glass roof was being constructed on top of concrete laid over the top of the walls of House 7. Soon afterwards, a visitor centre was constructed adjacent to the seawall at the west end of the site. The date of opening is unknown, but by then the Great Depression had impacted the world, and no doubt the expected visitors were few and far between. The Depression lasted until the start of World War II, which impacted the Orkney Islands greatly. Skara Brae once again slumbered unmolested for over 40 years after Childe's departure. Many questions remained unanswered, and in the early 1970s, interest in Skara Brae began to stir again. I shall cover the modern era of exploration in the next episode.